Welcome to Truth Telling with Elizabeth D'Alto, the podcast dedicated to focusing on the truth that is always evolving within us and around us, where we explore the potentiality of truth as a highly esteemed value at a time in history when most people have more on their plates than any one human should. If you're new to me, full expression is my jam. Some words people have used to describe me range from speaker, trainer, coach, healer, writer, spiritual advisor, teacher, podcaster, and someone even called me their soul Sherpa once. I'm less concerned with titles or labels and more interested in results, change, and creating a world we want to, can, and are proud to live in. A kinder, gentler, more curious, collaborative, reverent world where people respect each other's backgrounds, experiences, and truths. They trust in themselves, in life, and recognize that we need each other. And they know how to cultivate healthy relationships to true power, not the very unhealthy kind of power our current culture is predicated upon. Speaking of our culture, there's a lot of noise and ignorance in our current culture, and this show aims to cut through that by exploring the truths of a diverse range of incredible voices. From authors, artists, creatives, and educators to activists, speakers, and those in various scientific and esoteric fields, our guests hail from cultures and countries all over the world. We post a new interview every Monday, and if you want to keep up with the show notes and quotes from our guests, you can follow me on Instagram at Elizabeth D'Alto. You can expect a wide range of topics when you tune into this show. Everything from health, communication, money, success, parenting, desire, sex, love, and spirituality, to making pivots and transitions in life, and topics related to psychology, storytelling, gender and race issues, emotional intelligence, activism, advocacy, and much more. A few disclaimers. No episode of the show is meant for everyone, and every episode is meant for whoever needs it on the right day at the right time. Not all guest views will reflect my own, and that's intentional. We don't learn, grow, heal, or improve by staying in our comfortable bubbles with all of our people who look, think, or live exactly how we do. If you love what you hear and find it useful and inspiring, the best way to show your appreciation is to share the episode, subscribe to the show, and leave us a rating and review wherever you listen in from. Thank you so much for being here with me. Here we go. This is episode number 259 of Truth Telling with Elizabeth D'Alto, and today we're talking with Avery Neal, who has a book called If He's So Great, Why Do I Feel So Bad? This episode goes deep into unhealthy relationship patterns, abuse, and victimhood. And what I loved about Avery so much is her whip-smart, compassionate, and gentle demeanor while navigating a really intense topic. Avery's truth was around the resilience of the human spirit, and from there we explored big, hard words like abuse and victim, and why it's important to both use them and unpack them, as well as own them when applicable. We talked about striking a balance between sussing out your partner's issues and your own issues. And there's so many intricacies there, and I really appreciated the depth of her experience in helping to help us understand that. And we also got into the behavioral patterns of abusers and how to spot the warning signs, as well as the behavioral patterns of victims or those susceptible to abusive partnerships, which in a lot of cases is highly empathic and highly sensitive people, as I know many of you listening are. She gave us lots of examples from her practice and many more gems from her book. Now, I know every time I do an episode like this, unfortunately, it resonates with a lot of people. So please be gentle with yourself if this hits the mark for you in any way. And as always, don't hesitate to contact us or reach out if you need help. Since I spoke out about my own abusive relationship last year, I've received so many messages from others sharing their stories. So this topic is a really close one to my heart. You can find the show notes at untameyourself.com/TT-259. Again, that's untameyourself.com/T as in truth, T as in telling -259. And I know I remind you every single week, but maybe this is the week that you want to head over and check out our Patreon community and all the different ways that you can interact with me and each other. The link is patreon.com/Elizabeth Untamed. Again, that's patreon.com/Elizabeth Untamed. And I know a lot of people have actually never heard of the platform Patreon before. And sometimes people are resistant to getting on a new platform, but I can't tell you how easy Patreon is to navigate. I actually had that resistance myself, but there's an easy app. Everything that I upload over there, you can watch it right from your smartphone or listen to it right from your smartphone. It's super easy to use. So again, head on over there if you'd like to go a little bit deeper, a little beyond just these interviews, just these episodes, maybe do a little more work with me, a little more get to know the people in the community. It's a beautiful and easy and really affordable and accessible way to do it, which is one of the reasons why I'm so happy about it. So thank you so much. Let's get into today's show. All right. So Avery, I am excited for this conversation. When I was looking around your website and I saw the name of your book, I was like, damn, we need this. We being like the general population of women who listen to this show. I mean, I'm sure there are some men listening, and I'm actually sure that what you're going to describe for us today as we get into it also applies to men as well. But obviously you got to focus on, someone and what you know or whatever. So I respect that it's geared towards women, but I'm sure it's universal as well. So the first question I ask everyone is, what's a truth that's having a big impact on your life right now?
The famous question. I was ready. I think that for me right now, what's been really on my radar is the resilience of the human spirit. So I am fortunate enough to work with some wonderful women in my clinical practice, and they get to share some of them quite heartbreaking stories with me. And I'm just sort of amazed at their resilience, even after some terribly difficult challenges.
I appreciate that, especially at this time. I want to give context for people listening. So something that's like really on my heart and impossible not to bring up, even as like I'm batching interviews today. I'll probably bring it up in all of them. But at the time that we're recording this, Donald Glover's new video, Childish Gambino's new video for This Is America just came out. And there's so much, like this is the kind of art that speaks to our culture. And I'm watching our culture do what it does, which is so many people just strip away the parts that are comfortable, like the dancing. People are like, oh, I want to take dance lessons now. But meanwhile, there's so much nuance. There's so much messaging. It's talking about guns. It's talking about violence. It's talking about racism. It's talking about all these things. And I'm watching people as well in light of even, online at this time, the way people are approaching coming at leaders, taking people down, inquiring to try to get people to see themselves and do better around hard topics and hard subjects. But there's so much collective rage, which is rightfully so. And there's so much trauma, which again it's real, right? None of this should be bypassed. And so to hear you say the resilience of the human spirit, I'm just so happy and I'm so encouraged, because people leave comments on things all the time like, we're screwed. And I can't get behind that. Like my whole life revolves around that we're not unscrewing us, Right. And it sounds like yours does too. So I'm excited that you have a clinical practice. I'm excited that you can bring some deep experience and perspective and I want to say trained and educated. It's not to knock any other guests, but I think sometimes we get a lot of opinion that isn't necessarily rooted in practice when we're out on social media and just the blogosphere and things like that. So sure. I had to present some of that stuff because it's just up for me and it's my show, so I could do whatever I want. But okay. Did I already say the title of your book in the beginning?
You know what? I don't know.
I don't know either.
I don't know if we were recording.
So say it. It's so good.
Thank you. It's called If He's So Great, Why Do I Feel So Bad?
Oh, girl. Tell us why you wrote this book.
Well, so here's the deal. Abuse is a big word. And I think many of us, I know myself included, have a hard time with that word. However, a lot of women and men, to your point, find themselves in an unhealthy relationship, and they don't necessarily know that they're being emotionally abused, even if they are. And so with the title, I was really hoping to bridge that gap between women who are unhappy in their relationship. They're maybe, feeling depressed, feeling anxious, maybe have developed some unhealthy patterns, or just trying to survive their relationship, But yet they would never think of the word abuse, even though what they are experiencing may be, in fact, emotional abuse. So that was kind of the goal with the title, was to catch a reader who doesn't necessarily make that link to abuse.
I mean, that was me. That was me for 3 years.
Was it?
3 years.
Wow.
It wasn't until after the relationship ended that a really astute friend of mine who knew my former partner was like, hey, I want to tell you about my ex-husband who was a narcissist. And she knew damn well. That was a very wise way of being like, hey, this is what you were experiencing. This is why it was so hard. And I was like, what? And then I was like, and like it didn't. And so I want to ask, I love that you were honest about that abuse is a hard word. I think as well, anyone who is into self-help, growth, personal development, we have a major aversion to being a victim.
Yes.
Because we don't want to have a victim mindset.
Exactly.
But the thing is, if you're being abused, you are a victim of abuse.
Exactly. I'm glad you said that, because I think there's a lot of shame around the word victim.
Yep.
And what you just said is absolutely correct. This is, abuse is victimizing. So it's important, I think, to talk about that. And it doesn't mean that it can't be overcome and you can't grow from it and gain strength from it. All of those wonderful, beautiful things that are a result of the healing process. But the actual abusive dynamic is victimizing.
Yeah. So let's get into that, because if people listening are in this situation, like, if he's so great, what do I feel so bad? One of the books that I had looked at when I was in this relationship, I was essentially looking for your book. But one of the ones I found was Too Good to Leave, Too Bad to Stay.
Yes.
And there were these markers, and I was like, all right, like it's fine.
Yes.
But I feel like there's probably more to what you're talking about here that could be a little more helpful to people who are in these positions. So the question I want to ask is, what is the distinction between sussing out what's going on with the other person and what's actually your own stuff? I feel like that's one of the reasons we stay, because we're like over functioning and taking responsibility for our own part, and not really being honest about that, like that there's just some stuff that's not okay with us.
That's unhealthy. Yes. Yes. And I'm so glad you asked this question, because I think this is really one of the most common reasons why people stay in a relationship. They believe, okay, well, if I can just own this and take responsibility for that, it'll improve things. And so one of the things that I really want to sort of drive home is that there's certain patterns of behavior that we look for that indicate if a relationship is unhealthy or not. So we all have bad days. We all get cranky. We all get defensive. Sometimes, communication problems arise in relationships. But what we are really wanting to look at are patterns of behavior over time in a relationship. And one of the personality traits that I believe is quite common in someone who is being abused or who is in an unhealthy relationship is this sense of responsibility and taking on more than their fair share of the responsibility. And as a counter to that, often someone who's abusive is not going to take responsibility for themselves. So that's one of the sort of key characterological traits, is that there's this lack of responsibility, there's this lack of accountability. And so by default, the person who takes on more than their fair share picks up the slack, works harder and harder in the relationship, hoping to save it, hoping to make it work, especially if there's a long history or, children or finances are intertwined. And so then you start to see a really unhealthy negative pattern where the power balance is way off.
Yeah. So I want to ask you if there's anything that you could add to the distinction between responsibility and accountability. Something that I articulated only just a couple months ago is there's a difference between when someone's working on something and when someone's working through something. And to me, the difference is that you're actually seeing behavior changing, right? It's not just like people could talk all day long. I think that's one of the things that got me. That's one of the reasons why I stayed.
Yes.
My partner at the time was very good at,
Yes.
quote, doing his work, but things
Yes.
weren't changing. But I was giving this enormously generous benefit of the doubt because I thought he was working on it. So he was appearing to take responsibility. And in some cases, I think he really was. But the accountability part was where it wasn't, there was not accountability because the same stuff was just happening over and over again.
Yes. So it is really important to focus on the actions, not the words.
Yeah.
Because the words can be very misleading. They can be very flowery. They can be very tricky and leave you with this false sense of hope that things are going to improve. And so that's where the pattern comes into play. You've got to look at, okay, is this somebody who truly is willing to take responsibility for themselves and make actual changes, which is hard work. I mean, it's really, really hard work. Or is this somebody who's just saying those words, but there's no real follow through? The patterns are the same. Because with someone who's actually abusive, there is no real desire to change. They're okay with the way they are a lot of the time. They just don't, they think it's your problem. You need to change. You need to fix it. Even if the words are otherwise, the underlying message is you're the one with the problem. If you would just do this, then things would be better.
Yeah, yeah. And as well, I experienced that like, because of how you're being or doing or you are is why I'm being this way.
Exactly.
And you're like,
exactly.
Then just don't be with me.
Right. Exactly. That's exactly right.
I can't even count how many times I said that.
Yes. Well, and what you're describing is very, very common where, you get backed into a corner to where you don't feel like there's anything more you can do. You can't change anymore. You are who you are. And yet, an abuser will continue to attack that.
Yeah. So what are some of these other patterns? So we have the sense of over responsibility from one person and lack of responsibility or accountability in the other.
Yes. So I'll kind of describe some common personality features or behavioral patterns of an abuser first, and then I'll go into kind of the profile of someone who typically ends up with an abuser, or if they don't start out that way, they become that way very quickly.
Yeah.
So abusers typically, like we said, don't necessarily take responsibility for themselves. They also have a pretty negligible level of empathy. So they may say the right words, but at the end of the day, there's a disconnect. They don't necessarily feel true empathy and compassion for someone else. And so when their partner is struggling or is hurt, there's truly a disconnect there and a lack of empathy, which is very distressing for an abuser's partner.
Can I interrupt you?
Yes, please.
This was so huge for me to also realize the difference between experiencing empathy and performing empathy.
Yes.
So like you're saying, they know to say the right thing. Anyone that could read a friggin' book these days knows what to say when someone is having an emotional response to something.
Exactly.
There's no shortage of places to learn that.
Exactly.
Yes. And so for me, that was so huge because I was like, because he says the right things. And I'm like,
right.
Doesn't actually have the compassion.
And you can, as a human being, we are wired to pick up on those signals. So even if the words coming out, we want to believe them, we can feel if they're genuine or not,
I feel like that desire to believe overrides the feeling, though.
Well, it totally does. It totally does. Which is why education is so important, right?
Yeah.
It's just really key so that, we can figure out how we need to proceed. Okay, so then another thing that is common is jealousy, and this doesn't have to be necessarily jealousy over another relationship or familial relationships, which is quite common. And, it's rare that an abuser doesn't have those kind of territorial issues over their partner's other relationships. But it can also take the form of sort of a competitive vibe or a competitive tendency, like not truly wanting what's best for their partner, but feeling like that's somehow a threat to them or somehow diminishes them. And so you want to look for that jealousy, that competitive edge, not necessarily wanting to build their partner up, build you up, I should say, but more of a I want to make you lower so I can be higher type of thing.
This is really huge. And this is something I didn't realize until I have a friend, one of my guy friends, significantly older than me. He was dating someone and he was telling me about this dynamic with him and the woman he was dating and how she felt outmatched. And so she would do these little subtle things to peg him down. And when he was describing that to me, I was like, that's what's happening to me. I was just clueless. And, and I share that so openly because I think, and I'm sure this is probably one of the reasons why you wrote your book. I feel like smart, capable women go, how could this happen to me?
Yes.
Yes. I didn't waste my time with any of that mess because I had a bunch of older friends who it had all happened to. And they were smart, capable women. And so I was like, well, this shit, apparently, if you need to have this experience, you need to have it. Like no one is above this.
Well, that's it. And that's what I think is so important is that there's a lot of shame usually associated with going through something like this. And, people often are really surprised to know that they're not necessarily the only one who's gone through a relationship like this. Yeah. It happens to both men and women. It happens at, every stage in life. This is something that unless you really know the warning signs and you really are in tune with yourself and you're paying attention to the patterns and you're not overriding your feelings, it is very easy to enter into one of these relationships because they don't start out that way. They are gradual.
Yeah.
And so, by the time you're really in it and you're not feeling so great, there's usually a pretty big investment into the relationship, and it's not quite so easy to untangle yourself.
I think everything you just said was so important. Unless you know the warning signs, you're paying attention to yourself, you're not overriding your feelings and realize it's not like this in the beginning.
Right.
That's so huge. I remember when I got out of that relationship, my former partner was in another relationship very quickly afterwards. And I felt extremely conflicted about whether or not I should warn the new person. Mm-hmm. And I was talking to a friend who had an experience similar to mine. And she was like, don't even bother because she's not going to be able to hear you. She's in that, what you felt like in the beginning. Remember that.
Yes.
Would you have believed anyone if they told you no? So just let the person have their own experience. And so that point, I really want to reiterate that. It's not like it in the beginning. Like there are warning signs, like you said, but so many of us, we don't know this training. How would I have known until I freaking knew?
Exactly. Well, and if it's not directed at us, we don't necessarily see it as a warning sign, and some of these things, some of the early indications may even feel good to us. They may even feel like this person is really into us and everything is great. And wow, I've got somebody who's really paying attention to me. This is especially true for younger girls and women who are sort of inexperienced. And along comes this person who is, super into them. And, that's compelling. It's hard to walk away from that. It feels really good.
So what other pattern? I keep cutting you off, which is the nature of the conversation because it's so juicy and I have a personal experience. I'm personally invested in this one. But what other patterns?
Okay. So, sorry, let me go back to my train of thought. But there's usually a sense of entitlement as well. Mm-hmm. Abusers typically sort of have this mentality that kind of you owe me or the world owes me or my job or my boss or whatever.
Yeah.
And so you can really see that kind of across across the board. Now, I'm throwing out here sort of general features, but, everybody's experience is going to be a little bit different. And that's why I think it's so important to take the time to educate ourselves because, just because somebody presents one way doesn't mean that they're not a completely different way. And so really knowing this subject well, I mean, it's one reason I'm so passionate about educating young girls and women, the early things to look for, early warning signs, because it is so deceiving. Go ahead.
The question that was formulating was around, I still always come back to compassion, right? So this conversation, for anyone listening, isn't about blaming people and being like, F abusers, because people don't become that way because they feel great, or because they've had an easy life, or because they've had an easy experience. So yes. I do want to get to that and ask you actually what creates an abuser. But before I want to stop interrupting you and let you finish the warning signs.
Well, so actually, I'm glad you did, because that kind of goes into, another common personality trait, and that is typically these people have a high need for control.
Yeah.
And so there's such anxiety and such distress when they're not in control, that feeling is so uncomfortable that they usually do everything in their power to regain that control. And so, that kind of goes into what you're talking about with what makes an abuser. And I mean, we could easily spend a whole hour on that, but there's typically a very, very high need for control. And so, you'll see, manipulative tactics, you'll see lying, you'll see all kinds of tactics and techniques that they'll use to try to gain the upper hand, to try to gain that power, and to try to gain that control.
Cool. So any other common personality traits?
Well, so that yes, there are others, but those are kind of the big ones.
Got it.
And then in terms of the profile of someone who ends up in a relationship like this. Now, again, I want to stress that there are plenty of people who do not start out this way. But over time in the relationship, as their self-esteem plummets, they become more and more this way. But often the person who's with an abuser is pretty conflict avoidant, and this is something that if they don't start out that way, they become this way over time, because when they speak up, there's a punishment associated with speaking up. And so, most of us don't want to keep getting hurt, don't want to keep getting punished. So we'd rather just avoid it at all costs. And so that's what we end up with. We stop confronting the negative behavior. And in doing so, we give the abuser more power and more control. And we also lose part of ourself as well.
Yeah. I was just going to say, what else is in the profile of the person who ends up in that relationship? So
again, counter to the lack of empathy in an abuser is sort of this highly empathetic person. So often an abuser, which is another trait, will be very good at playing a victim and can be very convincing.
For anyone listening, I just gave a full body eye roll, because that was a big hallmark for me. Of the person just like victim all the time, 24/7. And I found that really went hand in hand with the entitlement piece.
Yes, absolutely. It's all intertwined.
Yeah.
So then, here's somebody who's really good at being a victim, and here comes somebody who's sensitive and in tune with other people's feelings and very empathetic, has a big heart. And so, of course, the natural response is, oh my gosh, let's talk about this. Let me help you. I want to make things better for you, or I want to help you or save you or rescue you or whatever. And so then, you get into a pretty unhealthy pattern pretty quickly. Right?
I want to love you more than you love yourself. And so maybe you'll start loving yourself too.
Exactly.
That doesn't work.
If I could just say how many times I've heard, if I could just love him enough, or if I could just love her enough, I thought that would be enough to make a difference, make a change. And unfortunately, I mean, I wish that were the case, but it's not.
That's one of the biggest things I realized. I was like, there's no amount of love that can outweigh someone's hate or just disdain for themselves or life from an external source.
Yes. And so then the next step, once you've identified that, is really taking the next steps to protect yourself, because I love that phrase, hurt people. Mm-hmm. Because it really is true. And so once you identify that somebody truly is really hurt and they are highly destructive as a result, and you can't save them, then the next step is protecting yourself from that person.
Yeah. And thank you for using the word destructive, because that's what it is. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's so hard to watch. It's so hard to watch. And if you are like an empathic person, or you're codependent, or if you have a lot of capacity, right? If you're strong, if you're a strong person, mm-hmm. you can actually bear a lot of the burden of that.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. For a very long time.
For a ridiculously long time. I mean, as I was coming out of my experience and talking about it as I felt safe and comfortable and it was appropriate, actually sharing about it on the podcast as I was healing was part of my healing. Because that was part of me speaking up for all the times that I didn't.
Yes.
And I mean, I used the discernment. There were times when I was not ready to share. I was like, if I feel revengey, I can't share. Right?
Yes.
It's not about
that's
that.
Good that you're aware of that. Yes.
Yeah. And if I felt like anyone's reaction to what I was going to say would negatively impact my healing, I was like, not time to share yet. But as I got comfortable and as I started sharing, there would be women who'd be like, oh my God, like I was feeling like I stayed in something for 3 years. I stayed for such a long time. And I heard stories from people 10, 15, 20, 30 years who were leaving at a certain, like, so this isn't something, and I reiterate this thing for anyone listening, no matter how long you've been in a relationship, or if you're like, oh my God, all the light bulbs are going off. This is ringing true for me. Just don't judge yourself. Don't judge yourself.
Absolutely. And something that I just thought of that I think is really, really important to stress is that if the word abuse is too strong and you've got an aversion to it, because I know that that's really true for a lot of us, it's this sort of mentality of, well, he doesn't hit me, or, he doesn't call me names, or, well, she doesn't rage at me in front of the kids, or, whatever it is. There's some type of rationalization why it isn't abuse. Use the word bully. Replace the word abuser with bully, and place the word abuse with bullying, because that's what it really is. It's psychological, emotional bullying, day in and day out from someone who knows you intimately.
Yeah. And I think, oh my God, I'm sure you talk about this in your book. The fact that they know you intimately gives them a massive advantage, huh?
It really, really does. And, that's one thing that I think sort of tying into what you said before makes it so hard to sort of not take that responsibility, because often there will be a shred of truth in what the person is saying, or it'll be an insecurity of some kind. And so it's easy for you to take that on and say, okay, well, you know what? They're right about this. I can see that, and then internalize that, and before not too long, you're whittled down.
Yeah. I want to talk about the healing part of it.
Yes, that's the exciting part.
That is the exciting part. Where do you want to start? You're the expert.
Well, I guess. This goes back to resilience as well. Often when you've been in a relationship like this, you're so worn down that sometimes even the thought of getting out of it just seems insurmountable. And so I think it's important to really acknowledge that that there is a way out, no matter how dark it seems, and no matter how poorly you feel about yourself. to be able to gain that strength to leave and to say no more, that takes a lot of courage. And certainly planning the departure from one of these kind of relationships needs to be done carefully, especially if there is any kind of history of physical violence, or even if there's just a gut feeling that it's going to be dangerous. It's important to pay attention to that and really have a safe exit strategy. But the other thing I want to say is that a lot of people struggle with the sense of a failed relationship and feel a lot of pressure, especially if they are committed through marriage or through children. And I just want to say that nobody deserves to be abused. Nobody deserves to be mistreated to the point where there's almost nothing left. And so, I certainly am always up for a relationship working out, if at all possible. And if there is any hope of that, that's wonderful. But unfortunately, in an abusive relationship, the abuse escalates over time. So even if there are sort of short changes, short bursts of real change, it's not sustainable given the profile of an abuser, their personality structure. So the abuse will just kind of continue, and it typically escalates. So, sorry, go ahead.
No, this is reminding me. I started following this woman on Instagram. I don't know how I found her. Her name is Demetria Lucas, and she gives relationship advice. And I remember reading through one of the threads where someone was saying that her husband had shoved her, and she told her mom, and her family was flipping out. They're like, "You need to leave, and you need to leave right now." And she was like, "It only happened once. He apologized. He wants me to tell my mom it wasn't that bad." So I guess in the context of what you just said, I actually want to, I'm so appreciative that you said, and I wrote it down, there's a way out no matter how dark it seems or how poorly you feel about yourself. Because what this woman was looking to justify staying. And it's cool that it was on an Instagram post, because not only did the woman lay it down with this is probably not the first time it's happened. It's going to happen again. The fact that he's wanting you to cover it up. She was highlighting all the red flags, but then the people in the comments were lighting up the post with experience and with all these things and being like, "Get out of there, girl." And I know it's so much easier said than done. But I guess some of the other, so we talked about the profiles, but I guess some of these little behaviors, these little markers, these things that people will ask you to do, these concessions that we'll make. Yes, absolutely. And that's why I think the most important thing is to pay attention to how you feel in the relationship, because even if you can't put your finger on it, that was the big thing that I wanted to highlight in the book, was that not all abuse is overt. Right. And so these more subtle tactics, they are really hard to identify. And so sometimes your biggest indication that something is amiss is how you feel in the relationship. So if someone is asking you to do things that make you feel uncomfortable, is asking you to be dishonest, if you feel like somebody is compromising you in any way, socially, financially, whatever, those are important things to really pay attention to. If you feel embarrassed around someone because of their behavior, I was embarrassed
that's a problem.
all the time.
Were you?
I was embarrassed all the time. But again, that was another thing that I took response. I was just like, "That's me. I'm being judgmental."
There you go. Well, I mean, thank you for being willing to share your experiences, because, this really is so common. And often, we feel very alone in it, especially if the guy comes across or the woman comes across as being this, really awesome person to everybody else. It makes it a little hard you feel like you've got to justify leaving them, even though, the relationship really is unhealthy.
And this is something common that I've seen come up in a lot of conversations with people who've had similar experiences with abusers. that people might even say to you sometimes stuff like, you're so lucky to be with someone like that.
Yes. Yes.
And it's like,
yes. Yes. Exactly. Am I?
I'm like, it's like when people say to someone, oh my God, your daughter's so adorable. And they're like, you don't live with her.
Right.
Earlier today, I did this yesterday. I met this woman with this adorable newborn, and I'm like, oh my God, he's so well behaved. She's like, you didn't see him 10 minutes ago in the bathroom when he was crying his face off. And I'm like, you're right, I didn't.
Exactly.
I'm sorry.
Exactly.
And it's like the same. Like, I remember people being like,
True.
you're so lucky. And I'd be like, you move in for a week. Tell me if you think I'm still lucky.
Well, and that's awesome when you have that sense of self and that confidence to even be able to say, yeah, well, it's not quite so great behind closed doors. But think about for someone who has been so whittled down and who has no confidence left and who really doubts, their feelings and ability to see things clearly. The response to that is, yeah, I really am so lucky. I need to really work hard to stay in this relationship and make sure to keep him or her happy.
Yeah.
And so that's a pretty concerning yet not too uncommon experience.
Yeah.
So, these people are often very charismatic, and I'm not trying to say these people or, make big labels here, but I think it's important for people to know that there are certain patterns and certain features that really often do clump together. And so, to be able to identify that, to be able to say, hey, wait a minute, even though you seem great in public, even though everybody seems to be, in your corner, I need to listen to how I feel. And you make me feel really terrible about myself. That's important to listen to.
Well, and then there's quotes, which we just take as they're true and don't question whether or not they're problematic. Like that famous Eleanor Roosevelt quote that says, no one can make you feel inferior without your own consent.
Yes. Yes.
Why is that a problem?
Right. Well, absolutely. I mean, that's a perfect quote. I mean, I could probably rattle off a few of my own that really get me going because it really does keep us in this terrible paradigm where we're blaming ourselves, thinking if we could only do more, if we could only speak up more, if we could only master perfect communication, if we could only, do X, Y, Z, things would improve. And there again, that's a form of blaming the victim, which is not good.
Not good. So part of the healing you mentioned was paying attention to how you feel.
Yes, not overriding your feelings.
Not overriding your feelings.
And that is tough after you've been in an abusive relationship because the only way you can survive in an abusive relationship is to override your feelings and keep moving on.
Right. So someone's coming out of this. How do they, I mean, you've mentioned resiliency a couple times here, but and I had this experience to have to build back up. Not even necessarily the confidence, but just like the energy to like be around anyone or other people. And, I was fortunate to just be like a young single person. It's not like I had to like take care of kids or a family. And like, I'm an entrepreneur. I had flexibility to be able, like, I had enormous amount of privilege through my healing process. And I know for sure there are people with tons more responsibility and less flexibility than I had. So what kind of recommendations do you make for people who have a lot going on but still need to take care of themselves?
Sure. Well, so the biggest thing is really education, recognizing and understanding what's going on and being able to step back from the relationship and looking at it objectively so you stop the cycle of blame and shame. And then I think another big part of it is giving yourself that space to heal. If you don't feel like socializing, if you need to protect yourself for a little while, if you need to lick your wounds, if you need to go through the anger and the hurt and the pain, and even just that process can take a very long time, especially when you start looking at the relationship objectively and putting the pieces of the puzzle together. It's not uncommon to have sort of memories coming back. And, we're talking about post-traumatic stress here. So putting the pieces of the puzzle together and giving yourself that space to get angry, to cry, to grieve, to mourn the loss of what you thought your relationship was, and it didn't turn out to be. I mean, that's heavy, and that takes some time.
That was the hardest part for me, for sure.
Was it?
Yeah. Realizing what I thought was happening was not actually what was happening for almost 3 years of my life.
Yes.
That was tough. So I have an interesting question.
Sure.
Is there any circumstance under which it's healthy for someone to, and quickly is going to be a subjective thing, but I want to say within the matter of weeks or months, to get into another relationship when they've come out of something like this?
That's a good question, too. I don't know that I can say definitively, one size fits all here.
Yeah.
It really depends on the person. It depends on where they are when they leave the relationship. Certainly, can a relationship be successful that's right on the heels of coming out of an abusive relationship? It's possible, but it requires sort of extreme awareness, and it takes a lot of patience and understanding on the other person's part as you move through all of these stages of processing and grief.
Yeah.
So, there are people who have navigated that successfully. So it's certainly possible, but for most people, it's the work is a lot more rewarding if they go on that path alone and they go on that journey alone. Because the other thing that's really important to explore on the journey to healing is what exactly was going on for you that you stayed in this relationship, and strengthening that sense of self, being okay with being alone and independent and on your own, so that you won't just settle for less than what you deserve. And so if you jump immediately into another relationship, it's really easy to overlook all that and not develop that sense of self that really is important in a healthy relationship.
So this is fascinating, because one of the things that I noticed as I intentionally was like, I'm taking a year off from men right out of the gates, and ended up being closer to a year and a half. But
Yes.
One of the things I noticed as I let myself feel and process through and work through everything from this relationship is all the stuff from past relationships that I had never dealt with. Because I had actually been in like 4 serious relationships almost back to back for like a decade, with only anywhere from a couple, maybe 6 weeks to 6 months in between them. And I didn't have the awareness. I didn't have the education that you're talking about here, that you're giving people. And so there was actually stuff not only to process from this past relationship, but previous stuff. And those people weren't necessarily abusive. It was just that I hadn't unpacked. I had just moved on.
Absolutely. Well, and it's so important to know ourselves as best as we can before entering into any kind of relationship, like you said, even if we haven't been in an abusive dynamic.
Yeah.
So, and if nothing else, to know that we can be alone, that we can do it, that we're strong enough, because, so often there's this fear of being alone and discomfort with being alone. And so to ease that discomfort, we just jump into the next relationship. And that's a real problem, because we're basically telling ourselves we can't be alone. We can't do it. We don't, and so we make ourselves much more vulnerable to ending up in a relationship where we're mistreated if we don't feel like we can truly be alone. When we know we can be alone and we feel happy and we develop a life for ourselves and we like our life, we've created the life that we want, then if somebody comes along that we want to be with, then it's because they enhance our lives.
Yes.
It's not because we're doing it because,
we just don't want to be alone.
There's no alternative and we're subtle.
Yeah. So what else? What have I not asked you? Are there any important elements that we haven't touched on yet?
You did a good job with the questions.
I'm super interested in this stuff. I obviously geek out on it a lot. What I love to do often when I ask questions is I know our community pretty well. They share with me a lot. So I'm just thinking of any scenario that we haven't really considered. And actually, so something I do want to bring presence to is we've had this conversation mostly in a like heteronormative dynamic.
Yes.
So do you have experience with non-binary people? Does gender orientation have any impact on these dynamics or no?
In my experience, no one is exempt from this. This is across the board. And so, the reason I chose to write this book about romantic relationships from the viewpoint of the male as the abuser and the female as the recipient of the abuse is because I work with women, and these are the stories that I hear all day, every day. And so I really wanted to go with what I, had heard the most.
Makes sense.
So, but I think I'm glad you brought that up because this happens across all relationships, and it's not just in romantic relationships. This happens in familial relationships. This happens in work relationships. This happens in friendships. Again, what we're describing here is bullying. And so that can happen really in any place.
I have a question. So if this is happening for someone at their job, so I'm coming back to this thing that you said that I feel like was very powerful. There's a way out no matter how dark or seems or how poorly you feel about yourself. If this is happening at someone's job and they need their job to live, if someone's in a circumstance, let me ask it this way, because it could be in any context. If someone's in a relationship, they know they need to get out of it. There's a person in their life that they know is a bully or an abuser. They know they need to get out of it, but they can't get out of it fast.
Yes, I'm glad. Well, this is a good one that I'm glad you brought up because this is common. And, this is common too if people have children and they don't feel like they can leave or they, are financially dependent. So I think the main thing that's important is really taking a step back and looking at the relationship dynamics objectively, because that will help you to not take those patterns and those insults so personally. You can begin to gain your strength when you realize the bigger game that's being played, really. It's like you can start to heal when you know and gain your strength when you know, okay, this isn't necessarily about me. This is a pattern. This is something coming up for this other person, and I don't have to take this on. And so then you can give yourself a little bit of space to start to process, to start to gain your strength, your confidence back. It's really important during that time to surround yourself with as many loving, supportive relationships as you can. I mean, we are wired for connectedness. We need that social support. And one of the things that's very common in a relationship like this is for the person to become more isolated. And that just, really is a detriment. It truly is. So the more we can focus on, building up our other support systems, investing in ourselves by doing the things that build us up, that make us feel good about ourselves, that make us feel connected to ourselves on a deeper level. That is all really important, so that even if we have to stay in the relationship, even if we are at a job we hate or have a boss that's mistreating us, or we have an abusive relationship that for whatever reason we cannot leave at that exact time, we can at least begin to gain our strength, making it easier to leave at some point when we can.
I love this answer. One of my mantras, so it took me about 2 months to get out of that relationship. I started the process at the end of July. It was middle to late July. It was officially over at like middle to late of a September. So it took about 2 months, and I had to actually call in some friends to help me. I was like, I got to do this. I can't not.
Good for you.
Start this conversation now, and I can't do it by myself. And so, because I knew that I would get hooked into the same kind of dialogue, the same kind of thing, and it would just turn into like this process fest that wouldn't go anywhere.
Yes.
But really realizing what you just said, that it wasn't about me. I had been taking so much over responsibility to go, got it. This has nothing to do with me. That mean thing, that critical thing, it's actually not. It's towards me. It's not about me. And so I had this mantra. The mantra was not mine. So when he would be saying stuff
Good for
that
you.
I just like, I was like, I can't take this in anymore. This isn't, I would just be thinking, I would almost like tune it out, and I would just be like, not mine, not mine, not mine, not mine.
Good for you. I love that mantra. That's
Yeah,
fantastic. And I mean, it kind of acts as a shield.
exactly.
So I'm glad that you shared that. I think that's a fantastic mantra, and probably good for people to keep in mind if they're in a relationship like this.
So what your answer was, start working on now knowing that it's not about you. Start to build up your resiliency even as you're on your way out. That is something that the person can proactively do, even if it's going to be like a couple months or maybe even longer, that like they can't get out of the job or they can't get out of the relationship or they need to move out or they need to figure out the finances or whatever. Like that is a tangible thing that people can start to do. Is there anything else?
Absolutely. Well, not tuning out your feelings. I mean, not overriding them, really paying attention to them. And, you can do this, start with things that aren't quite so intimidating. Think about how you feel in response to a movie, or think about how you feel in response to something your child did. Monitor those feelings, and instead of overriding them or talking yourself out of them or minimizing them in some way, listen to them, just acknowledge them. And in doing so, you also stop and you bring more awareness to this cycle of self-blaming, self-criticism. We take on our abuser's voice. We, even after the abuser is gone, often we keep replaying those messages in our head. And often you see this stemming from childhood. If we had critical parents, those tapes keep playing and those messages keep going off for us. And so it's consciously becoming aware of those messages and moving away from them, saying, no, I'm not going to keep beating myself up. I'm not going to become my own bully. Mm-hmm. I'm going to start replacing those messages with compassionate, loving, soft, kind, encouraging words of support.
Yeah.
Because that's what it really takes to leave one of these relationships. That's what it takes to heal from one of these relationships is self-compassion, self-love, building our strength, building our confidence back up.
Thank you for that. So I'm thinking about, I did all this work on myself. I unpacked. I took so much time to myself. And then I started dating again recently. And,
okay.
I feel like that is what let me know, because I'm like, listen, I could do all this work in a vacuum, but putting the rubber to the road is actually getting back out there and interacting with other people.
Yes.
And something that I was not excited to discover was actually how many insecurities there still were, especially around the specific things I'd been criticized around, one of which was my body. So it was funny because thank you. But this, I met this guy who was just like, just completely into me, exactly the way I am. And it was fascinating to observe what was happening in my brain of being like, not believing him, thinking he was just like full of shit. Like I couldn't compute. But I knew, I was able to observe it. So I didn't bring it out. I didn't tell him that, but in myself, I was like, oh, this is the next thing. So I'm curious again, and I'm projecting my own experience all throughout this conversation because that's what I have.
I'm so glad you are, because you're bringing a real life element to it, and what you're describing is very common. I hear these things all the time. And, part of what you're describing right now is being able to receive.
Yeah.
And that is something that is really hard for us if we've been in a relationship like this. And I think in particular, it's hard for women too, to receive, even if you haven't been in a relationship like this. A lot of us want to do for others and we feel more comfortable giving.
Yeah.
And so to take a step back and say, okay, it's actually okay for me to receive, it's not as easy as it sounds.
No. So cool. I was just making sure. I'm glad. Thank you for letting me know that a lot of what I'm sharing is common stuff that you run into. So yeah. And the receptivity piece, right? So I was just curious if there's anything else. So as people are feeling ready, they've spent their time on their own or they're feeling good and they're ready to get back out in the world, knowing that there might be some latent insecurities that you weren't able to bump into while you were on your own. Any advice for that?
Absolutely. So again, observe the feelings, observe what's coming up for you. It's good to process it. Know the warning signs, know what to look out for. Again, if you can't put your finger on it, but you just don't feel right around somebody, that's a big red flag. So protecting yourself and arming yourself with that knowledge, going ahead and listening to your own feelings of insecurity that are coming up, and practicing that self-compassion and changing the self-talk. I know, again, it's easier said than done, but that is the long-term goal. And then knowing and educating yourself not just on unhealthy dynamics, but what a relationship is supposed to look like.
Yeah.
How is it supposed
what the hell is
feel?
that?
That's a whole nother hour. But yes, exactly. And
Yeah.
and how do we know unless we've educated ourselves, or we've just been fortunate enough to grow up with parents who've had a healthy relationship that they've modeled for us,
Yeah. That's great.
So
thank you. The piece, especially about the education, I will say that that's the thing that gives me the most confidence. I'm 100% certain that I would never not be able to spot that crap again.
Good. Good for you.
And I feel like that's why I needed to take as long as I could, because I felt like I would not want to even risk not being able to spot it. And I mean, there's probably always a little bit of risk. I don't want to be overzealous or overconfident about it. But that was a big part. Going, okay, cool. I know what this looks like. Red flags all over the place. I could see all these red flags that never used to register before.
Yes, exactly. Well, and sometimes when you get into the right relationship, you get into a healthy relationship, and those insecurities are still coming up, doing some inner child work, doing some deeper work around where is that coming from, and what do I need to do to heal? What messages do I need to hear that I can give myself to help treat myself with compassion to move through this and have a successful relationship? That work is painful, but it is absolutely worth every minute.
I'm really excited to read your book. I feel like most people who do podcasts do the smart thing and read the book beforehand, but I love to dig in and then decide if I'm going to read the book, because there's so many freaking books to read. So I'm excited to read it. I hope everyone wants to go grab it. What is best to grab it on Amazon? What's your website? Give us all the places we need to find you.
Sure. So Amazon has it. You can also go to my website, which is averyneal.com. It's AVERY, N as in November, EAL. I'm sorry,
.com.
Not my email, .com. Thank you.
Got it. Yeah, don't give your email to everyone on the podcast.
Don't do that.
Your inbox would blow up. You'd have to set up a new email address.
Exactly. No, it's averyneal.com. And then it's also available at womenstherapyclinic.com.
Oh, cool.
So you can order it at any of those places.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for bringing your clinical background, your practice, your experience, your compassion, even just the way you talk about these things. It feels, I know how hard it is, and it feels worth it to hear you talk about it. So I hope this was super encouraging for anyone listening. I know what happens sometimes. Some of you might be having the realization that you're in a thing that you need to get out of. So reach out to me if you need to. Reach out to Avery if you need to. We have resources. We can help you. This is important stuff that you should not have to do alone. And since I have shared about this very openly on the podcast over the last year, plenty of people have reached out. We've actually helped, even inside some of my programs, we've helped people leave abusive relationships.
Oh, that's wonderful. That is wonderful.
Like you said, no one deserves that. No one should be sitting around and taking that nonsense.
Exactly.
Cool. So Avery,
thank you.
Thank you so much. Everyone listening, share this. Listen, if you have someone in your life and you see the red flags that they don't see, this might be one of those things that you go, hey, I listened to this. I thought this was fascinating. You don't have to say, hey, I think this is happening to you.
Exactly.
They'll get to this last part and be like, damn. That's why they sent it. But just send it over and just be like, hey, I think this is really interesting. What do you think about this? You never know.
Yes,
just like
you
that.
never know. And so often, if we're in a relationship like this, we work really hard not to see some things. So having somebody just casually mention it, can make all the difference.
Like
really.
My friend did. If that woman hadn't said something to me, I probably would have been in a fog for another 6 months before I realized, got to put my finger on what was happening and what I needed
What's
to work
going
on
on.
after.
Absolutely.
So, all right, Avery, you're amazing. We appreciate this so
Well,
much. You all
thank you so
listening,
much,
we
as are you. This
appreciate
was a
you.
treat.
All right,
Okay.
we'll
Well,
see you
thank you
soon.
so much. Take care.
And it's interesting because when you look at what people say they want and then what they actually marry, sometimes is the opposite of what they've said, and their patterns always were the same. So they were almost never dating their husband or wife. They were dating the opposite of their husband and wife. Like, and then they come to me and they're like, "What am I doing wrong?" I'm like, you're not dating what you said you wanted. You're dating the exact opposite of what you said. And it happens for both men and women.